There's a pattern that decides which nations rise and which ones fade into irrelevance. It's not military strength. It's not nuclear arsenals or carrier strike groups. It's something far more fundamental. Control the routes where goods, energy, and money flow, and you control who eats, who freezes, and who prospers. Lose control of those routes, and your power evaporates faster than anyone thinks possible. Right now, the world's trade routes are being redrawn in real time. The old highways are fracturing, new corridors are emerging, and the nations that understand this shift are positioning themselves to win the next century, while everyone else is still playing the old game. When most people hear trade routes, they picture container ships and oil tankers. That's part of it. But the modern trade route isn't just physical anymore. There's an invisible layer that matters just as much. The financial infrastructure, the payment systems, the settlement networks that determine whether a transaction between a buyer in Vietnam and a seller in Brazil can actually happen. Geography used to mean mountains and rivers. Now it means SWIFT codes and dollar clearing systems. Think about how trade actually works in practice. A company in South Korea wants to buy copper from Chile. The copper exists, the buyer has money. But between intention and execution sits a complex web of financial infrastructure, letters of credit, currency exchange, insurance, settlement instructions routed through messaging networks, and most critically, clearing through banks that operate under specific jurisdictions with specific rules. For decades, that infrastructure was concentrated in one place. The United States and its allies controlled the financial plumbing of global trade. SWIFT handled the messaging. New York handled dollar clearing. London provided insurance and legal frameworks. If you wanted to participate in international trade at any meaningful scale, you had no choice but to use these systems. This created something unprecedented in human history, a choke point that didn't require ships or soldiers to enforce. You could shut down a country's ability to trade not by blockading their ports, but by cutting their access to payment systems. It was elegant, powerful, and it worked brilliantly as long as nobody built alternatives. But here's what always happens when one power controls the critical infrastructure. They start using it as a weapon, not occasionally, not as a last resort, as standard policy. And the moment you weaponize the highway everyone depends on, you teach the world a very expensive lesson. You teach them to build detours. The timeline is remarkably consistent across history. A dominant power becomes the default route for trade. They provide security, liquidity, and trust. Everyone uses their systems because it's easier than the alternatives. Then the dominant power starts leveraging that position. Sanctions, asset freezes, exclusions based on political alignment. At first, it works. The targeted nations suffer, but something else happens simultaneously. Every other country watching starts quietly hedging. They don't announce it. They don't make dramatic statements. They just begin building backup systems, alternative routes, parallel infrastructure. Look at what happened in February 2022. Western nations froze Russian central bank reserves and cut major Russian banks from SWIFT. The immediate impact was dramatic. The ruble crashed. Russian imports collapsed. Financial chaos spread through Moscow. It looked like the ultimate demonstration of financial power, the ability to inflict economic devastation without firing a shot. But watch what happened next. Within months, Russia had rerouted energy exports. They were settling trades in rubles, yuan, rupees, and local currencies. The trade didn't stop. It just stopped flowing through Western systems. And critically, every major economy watching this unfold learned the same lesson. If you hold reserves in dollars in New York, those reserves can vanish overnight based on political decisions. If your trade relies on SWIFT, that access can be revoked. China accelerated its cross-border interbank payment system. Russia expanded its system for transfer of financial messages. India started settling oil purchases in rupees. The Gulf states began accepting yuan for energy sales. These weren't hypothetical backup plans anymore. They were operational alternatives processing real transactions. The numbers tell the story. In 2010, essentially 0% of China's cross-border transactions settled in yuan. By 2023, that figure hit 23% and climbing. The share of global reserves held in dollars has declined from 73% in 2001 to 59% today. These shifts sound gradual until you understand the scale. We're talking about trillions of dollars of trade finding new routes. This isn't the first time this pattern has played out. Britain learned it the hard way. In 1914, London was the world's financial centre. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. British banks cleared international transactions. British insurance covered global shipping. Britain controlled the financial infrastructure of trade just like America does now. Then World War I started. Britain began freezing assets, seizing accounts, using the financial system as a weapon against enemies. Tactically brilliant, strategically catastrophic, because neutral countries watching this realized their wealth wasn't safe in London anymore. If Britain could freeze assets based on wartime politics, what stopped them from doing it during peacetime disputes? The result took decades to fully materialize, but the direction was set. New York began rising as an alternative financial center. The dollar started competing with the pound. By the 1950s, the transition was complete. Britain still had influence, but the monopoly was gone. The reserve currency had shifted. The critical infrastructure had moved. The United States repeated the pattern. In 1979, Carter froze Iranian assets. It worked as immediate leverage, but central banks globally started quietly diversifying, holding more gold, spreading reserves across multiple currencies, building redundancy into their systems. Here's what matters about these historical precedents. The dominant power never sees it coming. They're too focused on the tactical win. Iran is isolated. Russia is pressured. The sanctions worked, but they miss the strategic cost. Every time you block someone from the highway, everyone else starts mapping alternate routes. And now everyone is building detours simultaneously. This isn't theoretical preparation anymore. The infrastructure is operational and processing volume. China's cross-border interbank payment system handled 80 trillion yuan in transactions in 2023. That's real trade flowing through non-Western rails. Russia's system for transfer of financial messages connects over 400 institutions across 20 countries. India settled $60 billion in rupee-denominated trade last year. These aren't backup systems waiting in storage. They're active highways carrying actual commerce right now. The scale reveals the shift. In 2010, less than 2% of international payments bypassed dollar clearing. By 2023, that figure hit 18% and accelerating. We're watching the fastest infrastructure transition in financial history because technology makes it possible in ways it never was before. Britain took 40 years to lose financial dominance after World War I. The current transition is happening in less than a decade. Now let's talk about choke points. Because understanding modern power means understanding that control isn't about territory anymore. It's about bottlenecks. 6 maritime choke points handle the majority of global trade. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Panama Canal, the Bosporus. These narrow waterways create natural leverage points where whoever controls passage controls commerce. The Strait of Hormuz might be the most critical, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But the actual shipping lane is just 2 miles wide in each direction. More than 20% of global oil passes through that gap, mostly heading to Asia, China, India, Japan, South Korea. 4/5 of the oil transiting Hormuz goes east, which means any disruption there doesn't just spike prices. It threatens the energy supply of half the world's manufacturing base. The Strait of Malacca carries similar weight, only 1.7 miles wide at its narrowest. 30% of global trade passes through. For China specifically, 80% of energy imports transit the Malacca Strait. That's not diversification, that's a single point of failure, and Beijing knows it, which explains everything they've been building for the last decade. What happened in the Red Sea starting November 2023 demonstrated how fast choke point disruptions cascade. Houthi forces began attacking vessels transiting to the Suez Canal. 40 ships hit by February 2024. The response was immediate. Over 2,000 vessels rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. Container traffic through Suez dropped 75%. Transit times from Asia to Europe jumped 25%. From Asia to the US East Coast, 47% longer. Shanghai to Europe shipping rates spiked 256% in 3 months. The Russell Group estimated $1 trillion in goods disrupted between October 2023 and May 2024. Egypt lost an estimated $7 billion in canal revenue. This wasn't a major war. This was a regional militant group with relatively simple weapons, creating global supply chain chaos because they controlled access to a choke point. Here's what matters about that event. It proved that modern trade routes remain as vulnerable as they were centuries ago. All the technology, all the satellite tracking, all the naval power, none of it eliminates the fundamental geography. If a narrow strait gets contested, trade stops or reroutes. There's no digital workaround for physical geography, which brings us to China's response to this exact vulnerability. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't an aid program. It's the largest infrastructure project in human history designed specifically to build alternate trade routes that bypass maritime choke points China doesn't control. Launched in 2013, the BRI now includes over 150 countries and 30 international organizations. Nearly 75% of the world's population. Over half of global GDP. The numbers are staggering. In 2022 alone, trade between China and BRI partner countries hit $2.9 trillion. That's 45% of China's total foreign trade, up from 39% in 2013. But the real story isn't the volume, it's the infrastructure. 6 overland economic corridors connecting China to Europe through Central Asia, bypassing maritime routes entirely. Railways through Kazakhstan, pipelines through Pakistan, highways through Southeast Asia, ports in Africa and the Mediterranean. This is route diversification on a civilizational scale. China looked at the Malacca Strait and asked, what happens if access gets cut? The answer is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a land route from Western China to the Arabian Sea, completely avoiding the Malacca choke point. Or the China-Europe railway network, moving containers from Chongqing to Duisburg in 16 days versus 40 by sea. The Belt and Road has created debt problems, absolutely. Pakistan needed an IMF bailout. Ghana and Zambia hit sovereign default with BRI loans contributing. But focusing on the debt misses the strategic picture. China isn't trying to maximize returns. They're building insurance, redundancy, options. If one route closes, 10 others remain open. The South China Sea dispute makes perfect sense through this lens. $5 trillion in trade passes through those waters annually. The 9-line China claims encompasses almost the entire sea. The artificial islands they built starting 2013. 7 reefs turned into 5 square miles of land. Military installations, missile systems, radar. The 2016 International Tribunal ruled China's claims had no legal basis. China ignored the ruling and kept building. Why? Because controlling the South China Sea means controlling the primary route between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It means the ability to monitor or potentially disrupt shipping to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. not to actually blockade them, but to demonstrate capability, to shift negotiating leverage, to turn geography into political power. This is where physical choke points and financial choke points converge into a single strategic picture. Look at what's happening with payment systems right now. Countries are building financial infrastructure the same way they used to build railways and ports. Russia launched SPFS after 2014 sanctions signaled vulnerability. By the time full SWIFT restrictions hit in 2022, they had a domestic messaging network ready. Transactions didn't stop. They rerouted through alternative channels, slower and messier initially, but functional. China went bigger. CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, isn't just a backup. It's a parallel highway for yuan-denominated trade. Every transaction that clears through CIPS instead of dollar-correspondent banks is trade flowing through infrastructure Beijing controls. As of 2025, yuan settlement handles a growing share of China's cross-border transactions. That's not replacing the dollar system overnight. That's building capacity so replacement becomes possible. Then there's the middle powers. India, UAE, Brazil, Turkey. They're not picking sides. They're optimizing routes. India buys Russian oil at discount, settles in rupees or dirhams. The Gulf states accept yuan for energy sales while maintaining dollar relationships. Brazil negotiates bilateral currency arrangements with China. This isn't ideology, it's logistics. If you can access multiple payment rails, you're not trapped when one gets weaponized. The petrodollar framework reveals the same pattern. For 50 years, oil priced in dollars meant everyone needed dollars to buy energy. That created forced demand, a mandatory route through dollar clearing systems. When Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil sales, when Russia sells energy in rubles, when Iran trades in alternative currencies, the mandatory route becomes optional. The dollar doesn't collapse from this, but the choke point weakens. Buyers gain alternatives, sellers gain negotiating leverage. 5 choke points now determine who wins trade wars, and they're not all on maps. Energy supply routes, whoever controls production, and export infrastructure sets terms. Physical shipping lanes, the canals and straits we covered, still matter because goods move through space. Industrial supply chains, rare earths from China, semiconductors from Taiwan, these are bottlenecks as critical as any strait. Payment rails, SWIFT versus CIPS versus bilateral arrangements, the financial layer that enables settlement. Reserve storage, where central banks hold assets and whether those assets can be frozen. Every choke point offers the same trade-off. Control provides leverage. Weaponization provides short-term pressure but long-term erosion. Because the moment you demonstrate willingness to block access, everyone watching starts building redundancy. History shows the timeline clearly. Britain ran the world's financial centre through London. When World War I started, Britain weaponized that position, froze accounts, blocked transactions, applied financial rules as tools of war, tactically effective, strategically catastrophic. Neutral countries learned their reserves weren't safe in a system that could be weaponized. Diversification accelerated. New York rose as an alternative center. By mid-century, the pound's dominance was finished. The US demonstrated similar power in 1979. Carter froze Iranian assets held in American jurisdiction. Billions locked instantly. The move worked as pressure, but reserve managers globally absorbed the lesson. Assets held in US institutions can be seized. So reduce concentration, increase gold, diversify storage. The threat itself changes behavior. Russia got the warning shot in 2014. Sanctions signaled vulnerability without full cutoff. They spent 8 years preparing, reduced treasury holdings from over 100 billion to nearly zero, tripled gold reserves, built alternative payment infrastructure. Expanded non-dollar trade agreements. When 2022 restrictions hit, the preparation paid off. Disruption happened, but not collapse. The pattern never changes. The dominant power controls the main highway, uses that control as leverage. Targets build detours, neutrals hedge. The highway loses monopoly status. Power becomes distributed. You don't lose dominance when you lose a war. You lose it when the world stops needing your routes. Britain didn't lose empire to military defeat. They lost it to economic exhaustion and the rise of alternatives. The USSR didn't fall to invasion. They collapsed when their system couldn't compete with other routes to prosperity. The US still has massive advantages: deepest capital markets, most advanced financial infrastructure, military reach, technological leadership. But the monopoly factor, the part where there's no alternative, that's eroding. Not collapsing, eroding. As alternatives scale, leverage declines. Who wins if this continues? China builds parallel infrastructure and expands UN settlement. Route hubs like UAE, Singapore, India gain leverage by connecting multiple systems. They become the switching stations between networks. Gold and assets that can't be frozen benefit as unblockable reserves. Any system that reduces dependence on the single choke points gains relative power. Who loses? Not catastrophically, but relatively. The monopoly holder loses the ability to flip one switch and stop trade. SWIFT becomes one network among several. Anyone overexposed to a single route, whether that's dollar clearing or Malacca Straits shipping, becomes vulnerable to disruption. The rule that never changes. Every empire gains power by building the main trade routes. Every empire declines when it turns those routes into weapons. Because the moment you weaponize the highway, you teach the world to build detours. Trade routes decide who wins because they're where economics, security, and sovereignty intersect. Control the routes, control the leverage. Lose the routes, lose the power. The geography hasn't changed. The stakes haven't changed. Only the maps look different now, with financial corridors running alongside shipping lanes, and both mattering equally. The world is redrawing the map, while most people aren't paying attention. New corridors are scaling. Old monopolies are fragmenting. The nation's building optionality, now multiple routes, multiple rails, redundant systems. Those are the ones positioning for the next century. The ones still betting everything on a single highway are the ones who will learn what every empire before them learned. When you control the only route, you have all the leverage. When alternatives exist, you have a choice to make. Keep weaponizing and watch the traffic move elsewhere, or accept that power isn't about forcing everyone onto your road anymore. It's about remaining relevant when other roads exist. That's the shift happening now. Not dramatic, not sudden, just steady, systematic, and irreversible.